Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a lecture on the concept of democratic experimentalism. This is a form of democracy that Roberto Unger defines in his book, Realizing a Democracy Realized. So what I want to do is look at this concept and try to understand where Unger is coming from, so that we can try to practice this in our everyday lives. So Unger's idea is fairly simple, right? Democratic experimentalism is an interpretation of the democratic cause, the most influential set of ideas and commitments at work in the world today. It combines two hopes with a practice of thought and action. So what he's trying to do is tell us how can we best live out the democratic cause, right? And he is going to do this by exploring two hopes, which we will go through, a practice of thought, and then understanding our actions. So what we're trying to do, again, is just understand what it is that democracy is and how we might live that out. So to overview, we'll just look at the two hopes, the practice, and our understanding of agency, and then we'll go through them more carefully. So the first hope is that we find the area of overlap between the conditions of practical progress and the requirements of individual emancipation. In other words, how do we make progress and yet also condition the world so that people can experience their own emancipation? Second hope is the work of building the overlap between practical progress and individual emancipation responds to the felt needs and aspirations of ordinary men and women. So we're not looking at what politicians think. We're not looking at what theorists think. We're looking at what the felt needs and the aspirations of you and I, ordinary men and women. So these two hopes go along with a practice, the motivated, sustained, and cumulative tinkering with the arrangements of society. So we continue to work with and change and tinker with the way that we organize society. And we do that with these two hopes in mind. And from that, we develop agency, and agency involves a duality thesis that we'll discuss, a correspondence thesis that we'll discuss, and a symmetry thesis that we'll discuss. So let's move into the first hope. And this hope is that we find some area of overlap between the conditions of practical progress and the requirements of individual emancipation. So what does he mean by the conditions of practical progress? He means how do we understand or set up the institutional arrangements in our everyday world? And so he's thinking here about economic growth, technological and medical innovation, and how these institutional arrangements, how they're conditioned so that we seek this progress. So he says that, quote, the development of our power to push back the constraints of scarcity, disease, weakness, and ignorance is the empowerment of humanity to act upon the world. So this practical progress is to push back against, to help us to overcome scarcity, disease, weakness, and ignorance. We do this through economic growth, we do this through technological and medical innovation, and through doing that, we are able to act on the world. The requirements of individual emancipation, on the other hand, entails freeing individuals from the hold of entrenched social roles, divisions, hierarchies, especially when these are drawn from inherited advantage. So, in what ways are we stuck in roles that we can't escape? Stuck in divisions that we can't escape? Stuck in hierarchies that we cannot escape? So, certain divisions might include economic divisions. Certain roles might be female roles versus male roles, and hierarchies that might be involved here, okay? And he's especially concerned when these are taken from, are combined with some kind of advantage that we inherit and is not part of our everyday activities. So to find this overlap, then, we have to realize that our social effort requires a collective learning, and that we use this collective learning to act on the lessons that we learn. So the idea here is that we experiment with both the conditions of progress and with the requirements for emancipation, And we learn from this collectively. It's not just I learn something or you learn something, but that we engage in a social attempt to understand what it is that we're trying to do. And so part of our task in building a democracy is to minimize any kind of barriers to our collective learning. So these barriers might be barriers that are brought up from differences in language, differences in culture, differences in urban versus rural settings, differences in wealthy versus poor. So what kind of barriers prevent us from joining together and learning from how we organize and construct both the possibilities for growth and the possibilities for emancipation. So, of course, we have to think about the security of the individual. How do we secure that individual from the incursions of society? And how do we broaden the possibility for opportunities to try new things? So here we need institutions to help individuals if the things that they try don't work out the way they plan. The reason that we need this is because we're doing this together. We're collectively learning from what people experiment with. Underlying all of this is the idea that we're developing our human powers through these social structures, through economic structures, through political structures, and other sorts of institutions, right? And we develop these human powers through resisting, overcoming, and revising the institutions that are involved in both economic growth and the possibilities for human emancipation. Now, when we think about the structures of the institutions, then there are going to be conflicts in these internal structures between practical progress and individual emancipation. So just think about how any kind of structure that you might think about, there's always the push, for example, economically, to allow more and more growth in the market, and yet also the push to allow individuals to enter into that market and find some kind of emancipation or self-satisfaction. And what we see is that there's this conflict that prevents that because successful market institutions do not want the competition from individual attempts to try to make something in the market or even to experiment within the market. So again, focusing on practical progress, we're thinking about economic and technological growth, medical growth, and the conflict that happens here between the economic growth and the moral experience. We can think about, for instance, human cloning. There's opportunities there for all kinds of technological growth, and yet the opportunities for moral experience are quite limited. We can see this in the recent television series on Netflix called Altered Carbons. And so if we want to overcome this conflict, what we have to do is cooperate together and figure out how cooperation and innovation relate to each other. In relationship to individual emancipation, the conflict is going to be between thickening practical, cognitive, and emotional ties and the subjugation and depersonalization that we experience in society. Again, here we're looking at the relationship between resistance on the one hand, or transistence, and solidarity or love, right? And this is grounded in biblical experience, right? That solidarity helps us to find that emancipation by uniting and overcoming this conflict between emotional ties and subjugation, right? What does my father expect from me? What do I need for myself, okay? And this capacity to love that we find in the Bible is something that grows through our ability to accept others. So that the freedom that we can experience is a freedom of this capacity for both self-possession and self-development. We can now move on to the second hope. And the way that Unger phrases this is that the work of building the overlap between practical progress and individual emancipation, which we've just been talking about, responds to the felt needs and aspirations of ordinary men and women. So again, when we think about practical progress, we're not just thinking about practical progress for the rich or for those who are in politics or any sort of idea like that. what we're trying to do is connect this to the needs and aspirations of ordinary men and women like you and me. This involves focusing on our agency. And here we have the duality thesis that is involved. Okay, the duality thesis involves alternative and persuasive ways to exist, to define and defend group interests. So obviously we have this need for others, but we also have interest in our own emancipation. So the one way of approaching this is a conservative and exclusive way of approaching it, so that social arrangements and order are taken for granted and we can't question those. The other, and the one that obviously Unger is going to favor, is the transformative solidaristic, where we have step-by-step change of circumstances. And what he's trying to do is combine these two for a more progressive way of responding to the institutions that can both prevent or help build individual emancipation. And so what we get here are both ideas and interests from the institutional settings that we're in, right? So the institutions that we are in provide us with the way that we can think about social life, and what we have to do is be able to shift those ways and put pressure on how these two, the ideals and our interests, relate to each other, so that we can go beyond those to new innovative ways of arranging social institutions. So Unger writes that the visionary element in politics provides such help. The intimation of a different world in which we would become slightly different people with slightly revised understandings of our interest and ideas supplements the cold appeal to group interest and familiar conviction. Thus, in transformative politics, we must speak in the two languages of interest calculation and political prophecy. What Unger is trying to say here is that through small changes, we come to change not only the institutions, but also change how we understand what interests drive us, what ideals we have, so that we can push beyond the institutions that we have and engage in a form of transformative politics. To go along with that, then, we have both a correspondence thesis and an asymmetry thesis. So correspondence implies that group alliances and antagonisms are always just the reverse side of a set of institutional arrangements and a sequence of institutional reforms. So how do we make sure that the kinds of alliances that we have with our groups and the antagonisms that we have with other groups are not just the result of institutional arrangements? And here we might think about police killings of black men, or gun shootings of kids in schools. And so how do we overcome that antagonism and alliances? We do that by trying to get together and have conversations. Right? The asymmetry thesis says that the relation between a political alliance and social or group alliance is always asymmetrical. So that means that even though we belong to certain groups and we have certain political alliances, the alliance and the group interest are not always going to be paired up one-to-one. So we have shared projects for developing and sustaining institutional arrangements that would support convergence of group interests, but don't always support everything that the group wants, and vice versa. And then also that political alliances not presuppose a social or group alliance. We can also have political alliances without groups, of course. Now that was the second hope. So the practice that we have to engage in then is institutional innovation. So again, motivated, sustaining, cumulative tinkering with the arrangements of society. And his idea here is that internal relations between understandings of ideals and thinking about practices of institutions have to go hand in hand, so that when we reform an institution, we're also trying to reform the ideals that we have about them, and we're trying to change our aspirations and our anxieties and deal with those in the new arrangements that we have, so that we can always push back. So there's this back and forth here, right, where we change the institution, change our understanding, change the institution, change the understanding, so we're progressing bit by bit. This is radical, though, because these step-by-step changes in the structure of society can happen to bring about a radical change over time. Now, I can't go into the other things that Unger talks about, but I'll just show them here on the slide. And what we're trying to do is